Hey everybody, welcome to A Mighty Blaze Celebrity Conversations. I am your host, Jane Roper, and I'm so excited for today's conversation. We've got two incredible writers. We have Christopher Castellani here joining us from Provincetown, I believe, and Laura Van Den Berg down in the Sunshine State. These two are just phenomenal writers of both novels and short stories, and I'm super excited for their conversation today. As always, if you have questions that you would like to throw out to the authors, oh my phone is ringing. I'm just going to ignore that. If you have questions that you would like to throw out to the authors, please feel free, and if we have time to get to them, we will. I'm just going to do some quick intros of these two, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to chat. And my phone's going to stop ringing any second now. I know it. It's going to go. Okay, I'm just going to talk right over it. So Christopher Castellani is a son of Italian immigrants and a native of Wilmington, Delaware. He currently lives in Boston most of the time, where he's artistic director of Grub Street, the country's largest and leading independent creative writing center. Chris is the author of 3 critically acclaimed novels: A Kiss from Madalena, which was the winner of the Massachusetts Book Award in 2004, The Saint of Lost Things, an IndieBound notable book, and All This Talk of Love, a New York Times Editor's Choice finalist and for the Editor's Choice and finalist, for the Farrow Grumley Literary Award. He's also the author of The Art of Perspective, Who Tells the Story, a collection of essays on point of view in fiction that I very much recommend to writers out there. It's fantastic. Chris's newest novel is Leading Men, which I happen to have right here. For which he received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacDowell Colony, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Leading Men was published in 2019. In addition to his work with Grub Street, Christopher is on the faculty and academic board of the Warren Wilson MFA program and the Bread Loaf for Writers Conference. He holds a master's in English from Tufts University and an MFA in creative writing from Boston University. And also, Chris was my first ever creative writing teacher, so he holds a special place in my heart. He got me.
To you.
He got me hooked on this crazy, ridiculous thing. So
I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Damn you. Laura Van Den Berg. Laura is the author of 3 short story collections, The Isle of Youth, What the World Will Look Like When All the Water Leaves Us, and her most recent collection, which we're here to celebrate today, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears, which was published by FSG in July. She's also there it is, awesome cover. And I now, having read the title story, I know what the lamb is all about. Laura she's also the author of 2 novels, Find Me and The Third Hotel, the latter of which was a finalist for the Young Lions Fiction Award and named a Best Book of 2018 by over a dozen publications. Laura's short stories have appeared in dozens of publications as well and been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories, Best American Mystery Stories, the O. Henry Prize Stories, and the Best Non-Required Reading. Her criticism and essays have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Oprah Magazine, Bomb, and Vogue.com. Her new short story collection, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears, has garnered rave reviews. It was named to multiple best and most anticipated lists, including the New York Times 16 Books to Watch for July, the August Indie Next list, and Time Magazine, and Esquire's, and O's, the Oprah Magazine's Best Books of Summer 2020, and a bunch of other ones, which I can't name all of them. I also didn't have room for all of the amazing awards and fellowships that Laura has won, so take my word for it, they're awesome. So I had to pick between reviews. I always try to pick out a few little blurbs to read about the book, and this one I liked the most. Gabino Iglesias of NPR says of it, exquisite. It took a decade of writing book reviews to get here, but here we are. I've used exquisite. The stories in Laura Van Den Berg's I Hold a Wolf by the Ears are exquisite, unsettling and bizarre, coming at you from weird angles to hit you in unexpected ways like the well-trained fists of a professional boxer. Very cool. Laura has taught creative writing in the MFA program at Columbia University, the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College, and elsewhere. Born and raised in Florida, she splits her time between Central Florida and the Boston area. Welcome, Laura. So great to have you here.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for being here.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura, for being here. And thank you, Jane.
Thank you all.
We're all so happy.
All right, we're done.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Tune in next week. All right, I'll turn it over to the hoodie twins over here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we did not plan this.
We did not.
Yes,
plan
no,
this.
I know.
Yeah. Laura, I cannot tell you how happy I am to be able to, this is such a luxury for me to be able to have this time to speak with you about this book, which, I mean, you already know that I'm a huge fanboy of your work. And I, particularly love this latest collection. And I have a zillion questions. I have a zillion quotes. I have a zillion everything. But we won't get to all of them. But I thought that I would just, first of all, congratulate you on this incredible book, and all the awards and all the accolades are so deserved. There's really there's no writer like you out there right now. Your sensibility, your ability to just tell the story in such surprising and unexpected ways, and your ability to just sort of create this reality that is our reality, but isn't, and yet allows us to see the reality that we're in so much more clearly, is just so incredibly thrilling, just as an artist. So I just am in such admiration of what you do. And so I just want to,
thank you.
I could go on and on, but I do want to, and I really
this is the nicest book event I've ever been to. That's so great.
Good. I'm glad things are going well. Yeah. So I thought I would start just with an easy, a relatively easy question, I guess, which is just I know that a lot of these stories, a bunch of these stories had been published, in various journals before, but I wanted you to talk about just how they came together as a collection and sort of how you structured it and what you were hoping to do with it as a collection. Because I'm one of those people that if I get a short story collection or a poetry collection, I always have to read them, from beginning to end. I feel like it's sacrilege to go in and out, but I don't know if you feel that way, and I don't know if we were trying to tell a particular story in the way it was ordered. So
I do. I get very distressed when people are like, oh yeah, when I get a story collection, I really like to I'll start in the middle and then read the last story and then skip back to the beginning. I'm like, no. Become very, very draconian. Yeah. So I mean, to me, this sort of the whole part of the art of the story collection is the world, the bigger world that the stories build, and the sort of larger conversation that the stories are able to have together. This was kind of an unusual process in that often for my past two collections, at a certain point I wrote maybe a string of stories that had a certain amount of thematic overlap, and then I had sort of a thematic frame that I was working within, and then was sort of conscious of that. With this book, I had at one point I knew I wanted to work on a story collection, but I didn't really have any kind of frame or container in mind. And so I decided I'm going to print out every story that I've written in the last, it's 10 years or since my previous collection. And so, I had 400 pages worth of stories, and I was like, nobody wants a 400-page collection. But it really, I mean, I had stories that I couldn't imagine putting in a book, and I had stories that I could imagine putting in a book, but I really didn't have the sort of frame or the shape of the thing. And then in 2018, I was at an artist residency, and I was only working on stories there. And I wrote 6 stories over the course of one summer, 4 of which are in the collection. And all of those stories dealt with hauntedness, the spectral, etc., in one way or another. And then sort of those stories, the presence of those new stories really distilled the entire project. And once I had hauntedness as this kind of framework to move within, I was able to make decisions about what other stories would be included and which ones would fall away. So it definitely took kind of time and patience, and there was this long sort of feeling out period. But George Saunders has this spoken beautifully about story collections, and he talks about the idea of stories building this sort of like understory. There's this kind of conversation that the stories are having with one another, and it builds into this sort of collective experience. But I love the idea of entering into a collection and feeling like I'm entering into a distinct world, and every story is its own thing, and it can sort of, and it can stand on its own. And yet there is this sort of uniting sensibility, or this feeling that like all of these characters are moving through the same kind of underworld, and they could be,
Absolutely.
they're not exactly related in that it's like a collection that's linked by character, but you have a sense of sort of lives brushing against each other.
Absolutely. And then you definitely achieved that hauntedness through all of these stories, but in different ways. It's not the same kind of hauntedness. It's not the same kind of uncanniness or weirdness, but they are in some ways, related. And there are these motifs that go throughout, where they do feel like they're occupying the same world, but not exactly. Like, for example, I think there are at least two stories, or I know there are two stories that mention the woman who's crying in the upstairs apartment. And when one story, that character figures, a lot into the story, and then in the other they're just mentioned. Or there's the boy who's sort of the reflection of the boy in the photograph, and then there's a reflection of the boy in the window of the car in another story. And so there are these like direct resonances throughout, but overall it is a kind of sensibility that is carried through in each of the stories, which I think makes it feel like I get a lot of students asking about, how do I put together a story collection? Do I have to have them linked? Can I call it a novel and stories? But in very few story collections, I think, are linked by sensibility as successfully as this one is. Did you do anything to sort of like, to make any direct links among things, or like, did you change the stories after they were published to put in this?
Yeah, in some cases I did. I was thinking about it. In some cases it also was pulling links out, because like many writers, I have sort of like an obsessive brain. So it's like you can see, you're like, oh, like this is when Laura was going through her photography phase, So in my case, it's often about like, instead of amplification, like pulling the kind of weaker links out, right? And leaving the ones that are more, the most resonant. But also I think order is so important in a collection. Like it can really impact the way that we read. And I had done, a bunch of different versions of the order, and then finally found one that I was satisfied with, and sent it to a writer friend. And she wrote back and she was like, how would you feel if I completely redid this for you? And I was like, have at it. And she did this incredibly generous thing where not only did she redo the order, but she wrote a sort of like articulation of like why I think this story should be first, and this second, and this third, and so on. And one thing that it revealed to me is that I had been thinking about order like very literally, where it was like, okay, the Italy story should be together, and then there's a story called Last Night, so maybe that story should be last because it's called Last Night.
Right.
And I had, I think it's like, I'm sure you've had this experience sort of editing. It's like there's this point where you're just so close to the project that your perspective is constricted. And I think like that was like, I was really having a hard time stepping back and seeing the larger architecture. And so she was like, I think, we need to put Last Night first because it's the only story in the collection that is working sort of from the space of autofiction. And so like, let's start in that sort of, that kind of like more constricted space, and then telescope out. She thought the title story should be last because she felt like it had the most of all the other stories like in it. Like it was the sort of like sensibility hybrid. And so I think that through the reordering of the book, and this really generous act of reading that I was able to sort of be the recipient of, I think that usefully amplified a lot of the echoes to like just the right degree. You know what I mean? It was just like through that kind of sequencing where it wasn't so those stories weren't so close together where the amplification was like too loud, nor were they like so far apart that it became too diffuse. So I think that's where like order can make a huge difference in sort of the kind of holistic impact of a collection.
Absolutely. Well, that's a very good friend and a good reader that you have there.
Yes.
So, I want one of those. And you mentioned, you mentioned Florida, you mentioned Italy. Like these stories take place in so many different places. Iceland, Mexico City, Italy, Florida, as I said. And I was thinking about if you could. I was wondering how. And I know that you travel a lot, and to do residencies in various places, and I know the place in Italy where you were, and it was so great to revisit that exact little town above Trapani where you were. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about place and about how place affects your like does your writing change when you're in these places, or does the place become its own kind of character that you respond to? Or like, I just wanted you to talk, just, it's not a very good question except to say, talk about place.
Talk about place. Yeah. I mean, places, I can't begin a story if I don't know where physically I am in the world. Even I would imagine like there's some stories where Boston, like, I mean, Friends is set in Cambridge. Like like Cambridge isn't named, but if you're familiar, you would be like, oh, I like know where that park is, and I know what river is being referred to. And so even when place isn't explicitly named, it's essential for me imaginatively to feel anchored in a kind of specificity of place. And I think, I mean, to live in Florida is to feel a sort of like unrelenting, saturation of place. I mean, Florida place is like omnipresent all the time. And it's been, before we went live, we were talking a little bit about, where we are right now. And I've been in my hometown since March, and we'll be here for a while longer. And my husband, Paul, who Chris, knows well, is like a lifelong New Englander, and he's never spent this much time in the South. And there are like lizards inside all the time. There are like ants coming in through the door. And he was just like, and I was like, this is just how it is here. It's like,
what kind of a life is this?
Yeah, exactly. There's this like really nice little arch with a kind of jasmine arbor, and then we looked up and realized it was filled with snakes.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sort of a general aura of like pestilence.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Come visit.
Yeah. But yeah, how can you not write about that, right?
Yeah. So there's this, I mean, so I grew up here. So there's this kind of, I'm accustomed to this kind of like this sort of unrelenting saturation of a place. And that's something that I think about a lot in the Florida stories specifically, but it's really, but I mean, it's so important in the other stories too. And I think, there's I've traveled to like many places that I've never written about and can't imagine writing about. And there are many different reasons for that in each case. But I think in some cases, it's like you go into a place and just like a portal opens in the imagination. And that's so how I felt in Erice, this small Italian village that Chris and I have both been to teach. And when I was there, it was just the fog. It was the densest fog I've ever seen in my life. Like you needed like a flashlight just to walk around in broad daylight. And then meanwhile, there was this Italian road race on this very steep, like hilly uphill road with no guardrails, and it was so like windy that people were getting car sick left and right, like in the van coming up from the airport. And I'm just like, what are you doing? Like you can't see your hand in front of your face. And the funicular, so the road in and out was closed, and then the funicular was closed because of the fog. And I think in reality, there is like a secondary road that if you could take out of the village if you had some sort of emergency. But the portal that opened in my imagination was like, what if you couldn't leave? Because it seemed like the idea of being sort of trapped there or stuck there like seemed very possible. So I think, I mean, we see the world differently. I think our sight changes when we are just in a new or unfamiliar setting. And I think sometimes, these sort of like scenarios open or portals open, and we can see kind of story happening there.
what I love is that you kind of, I mean, again, having been to that same place, there wasn't a road race when I was there, unfortunately. But I remember that fog. I know that hotel. I think I know, Filippo or whatever the guy who worked there. I think, I've been to those restaurants. I would have written a completely different story, bringing my own kind of sensibility for whatever it is to it. But you kind of like, Vandenbergified Eriche in this way that you did for Mexico City, and the way that you did for Cuba and the Third Hotel, and and that you do for Florida, and you bring this kind of, you transform the place with the way that you see it, with that portal that you see that the rest of us don't see, and like that's what's so exciting, to read in your work. So I just, I wanted to say that, and picking on the theme of place too, like another kind of sort of theme that goes throughout is this sort of sense of like, I don't know, impermanence or the transitoriness of spaces, right? Like so many of the places that you write about are, apartment complexes, motels, and these sort of places that are, like you describe them as these, labyrinthine apartment complexes ringed by interstates. Like they're like places where things are kind of moving in and out, and nothing is sort of stable, And I mean, Florida is the perfect place, of course, to describe these things. But I feel like, but you bring, again, those kinds of themes, for lack of a better word, to pretty much everywhere you go. I mean, everywhere your stories go. So I was just wondering if you not had that in mind as an overarching theme for the collection, but like what your interest is in these kind of like, for lack of a better word, just these transitory spaces, experiences in your work.
Yeah. Well, I have maybe like a slightly different answer for the Florida set stories, but for the other stories, I'm really interested in writing about work-related travel, because I think that that's like a very specific category of experience. It's like, you're not a resident, you're not like an insider, but like, nor are you just a straight tourist either. You know what I mean? You're like a tourist with a purpose, or like a tourist that somehow, because you're making contact with kind of the like real world, so to speak, of the place, you somehow become like a little bit more integrated into the place. And I think, we both have done a lot of travel for work and for, teaching and book events. And it's a really interesting, I think, kind of category of experience. And that's the situation in Carolina, like the narrator who comes upon her ex sister-in-law, who was living in Mexico City unbeknownst to the narrator, and his entered into a state of homelessness in the aftermath of a major earthquake. And I was in Mexico City, like right after the last really significant earthquake happened there. And so it was sort of a merge of that landscape. And then also thinking about, I had this idea for a story about this woman who had this brother who had been violent in past relationships, and that she was really in denial about his capacity for violence, and that somehow she would come upon his ex-wife, and they would be sort of moved into a space of kind of confrontation or reckoning. And I kept thinking, but like, where could this happen, and how could this happen, and how would they sort of how would they meet each other, right? And it seemed like she needed to be out of her usual context, the narrator. And then I was like, I will send her on a work trip. And the work trip, she's the curator and part of the art world, and it made sense for her to be in Mexico City for an arts event in the conference in the aftermath of this, this major,
so interesting.
This major earthquake. So they were kind of like all of these different little sort of planets of consideration that kind of like merged into the same galaxy. But I think that like that is its own. I mean, travel is inherently liminal, right? It's like, and that old sort of cliche, I would stay here forever if I could, or I wish this trip would never end. It's like something that we tend to not say. It's something that only becomes possible to say because we know that it will end.
Right.
and so it's like the nature of travel is like liminality and impermanence, and I think that in some ways like work related travel adds a kind of anchoring, but also an additional layer of liminality where you're again kind of like you don't necessarily fit neatly into the sort of usual, either you're like a resident or a tourist and you're the sort of slightly other thing. So I was interested in Carolina specifically, and that comes up in the third hotel too. And then I think in Florida, like on the one hand, in Central Florida specifically, like there is this omnipresence of sort of nature and space, but then there's also this sense of nature having been just decimated to make space for these like massive, apartment complexes, malls, and parking lots. And when you have situations where it's like you can have like a little man-made pond, or even like a flooded, like median or something, and there's like an alligator in there, and it's sort of like how does this happen? And it's like, well, their habitat has been, decimated to the point that they are desperately looking for, water where they can find it. So there's that kind of like duality there. Of this like intense sort of like monstrous like man-made landscape, human-made landscape, while also feeling sort of this kind of like wildness or encroaching nature at the same time. And I feel in Central Florida specifically, I really feel that tension a lot. Like I can drive, from my hometown, like I can drive like 15 minutes one way, and I'm on like an unpaved dirt road, like driving towards like a swamp, and it looks like I'm like in Jurassic Park. And then I could go, 15 minutes the other way, and it's like the natural world has been completely eradicated. Like there's no grass, there's just concrete.
Yeah.
Before we leave the topic of place entirely, I have a really cool place related question from a viewer who I think you guys both know, Alex Marzano Elizabeth, who's so Alex was wondering that, talking about this idea of like place being a portal to the imagination. They were wondering if this has happened for either of you. Has the pandemic in quarantine and COVID times, has the pandemic experience of time become kind of portal laden place? So adding another dimension in here.
My gosh.
Experience that at all? Yeah. Portal time, or portal like a COVID time, or quarantine time. Does that open up? Because certainly a lot of us writers are not writing in the midst of these times. So.
Yeah, I feel like I'll just answer really quickly that I feel like I have had more space for reading than I have for writing during the pandemic, and especially for novels. And novels are, about time. Like novels for me are just like, they're all about just suspension of time, or just a slowing down of time. And so I've just felt like the novel has been my best friend during the pandemic. And so for me, that's been the most I've always loved novels, but it's been particularly like I've rediscovered my love of novels during this time. And I'll just, before I let Laura answer it, I'll just say real quickly that one thing that what you were saying about Florida and about, the transitory nature and all of that stuff, and the, everything that you were saying about the way that nature and the modern life are related, makes it really does feel like the perfect, like that the short story is actually the perfect form for describing or amplifying or documenting that kind of experience, that actually, like, even though, again, I love reading novels, that there is a reason why these stories are working so well as stories, because it's so thematically linked to what you just said. So anyway, that was my inarticulate description of that.
I know what you mean, though. I mean, it's like stories, like the strategy of the story is like a particular kind of intensification, and it's kind of like it's like a firework or something, you know what I mean? Yes. It needs to move. Even, I mean, some of my favorite stories cover tremendous like expanses of time. So
Right.
I really, I love stories that are really capacious in their representation of time and experience, but even those stories need to move with a kind of like swift brightness
Mm-hmm.
that is really, you know, is kind of archetypal of the form. But I would totally second what you said. I mean, I have been writing, but I think reading has been the better companion. I mean, partly my writing these days has been because I am in this place that I had you know, not expected to be in for so long. I mean, I think a lot of my writing is almost more of like a documentary area in nature, where it's just sort of like it's recording. I've had a daily diary project that I've been doing for a while, which is, it's not something that I've ever done, but it felt like the right thing to be doing while I've been here, because it's like the landscape on the one hand is very familiar, but it's also changing. I mean, even though like we're, you know, 45 minutes from the coast, I mean, there's so much more even that far from the coast, just in terms of flooding. You know, we get a lot of rain in the summer, and there's been an intensification in the amount of storms that we're getting. You know, it's like you can really feel the changing climate, like the lakes are flooding, they wash out roads, you know, sewage systems are flooding. We feel, I think, that sense of starting to become overwhelmed by water, and like we are not on in coastal Florida. You know, we're like 45 minutes inland, and still that sort of you know, the presence of the changing climate is really tangible. So I think that like, you know, I probably, when in my life will I be here for this long again? You know, I can't say. And so that sort of need to kind of like write stuff down and document and like actively remember has felt important. And I do think it's like representation of time. Yeah, I mean, it's like thinking about breaking time off into these like little fragments and writing them down, and it's a really different way of sort of being in time on the page. But everything that you said, Chris, about reading was like so resonant, because I think that books have been, because time has also felt like so like just like a soup, you know. And I'm, you know, teaching again, and so like the rhythms of the semester have like concretized time a little bit more. But I think early in the pandemic, two friends, writer friends, we decided to do like a little mini book club, and we thought we would read sort of canonical books that we hadn't read before, because it seemed like a good time for really long books. And so our first book was Don Quixote, which none of us had read. And it's very long, and it took us, I think we read 100 pages a week, so it took us, you know, some weeks to get through it. And there really was like the progress of my bookmark through those pages became like more meaningful than any kind of calendar or clock. It was just like, it was some sort of like evidence, scant but vital evidence of forward movement and still being in time. And it really like, it was so, I don't think it was until that we had finished Don Quixote that I realized how like held I had felt by that experience of using sort of a book to like understand how time was moving.
That has been the way I've gotten through this. Yeah, I've been doing that not with a friend, but with just every morning before I do the doom scrolling and all of that, I've been reading like a certain chunk of a different canonical book. And at first I thought I was hoping I'd get through the first one before the pandemic ended, because it was supposed to be, you know, a month or two. I'm like, God, I hope I finish this book. You know, it was Middlemarch. I hope I finish Middlemarch before the pandemic is over, you know, and like 5 books later, you know, I'm still like, all right, what am I going to, I was actually thinking of Don Quixote next. So that's really,
that'll keep you busy for a while. Yeah,
exactly. So I'm in the middle of Proust right now, and which is a whole different relationship to time, and it's like crazy. But anyway, did you have another question, Jane, or should I go to one of my other questions?
Ahead.
Okay, because I was going to get a little micro because if it's okay,
cool.
because we've been talking big, and you know, you mentioned like capaciousness of stories and all that, and one thing I like, your stories are so like I when I was reading them, I kept thinking like, how is this story, like if I was going to like diagram this story or like make like a picture of the story, like I kept thinking how kind of asymmetrical they are, you know, how they don't like in so many stories, I can see kind of the shape, like it goes kind of like that, or it go, you know, like they're kind of familiar shapes, and they're, you know, those stories are great. But what I love about your stories is that they never quite, they have these like kind of like sharp shoulders, or whatever that expression is, or I'm gonna mix my metaphors all over the place, but or sharp elbows maybe they have, and they actually are incredibly, for stories that are often so narrow in the sense that they're in somebody's consciousness, they encompass so many different histories within some of the same stories. And so I was just wondering how you think of structure within a story. Like, how much of it do you go into thinking, oh, this story is going to look like this, or this story is going to look like that, or does the story kind of like take you on its own journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think a bit of, I mean, the story always takes me on its own journey. Sure. You know what I mean?
Right.
And like I was just thinking about Hill of Hell, which is a story that there's an opening scene that's set on a train.
Yeah, that's one of the ones I was thinking of for this, because that just went in a direction. I'm like, wait, where is this going? And it was just perfect. Anyway, keep going.
And then there's this huge leap in time, and then you kind of move through time pretty quickly, and a lot of like fairly dramatic event pretty quickly. And that was such sort of that idea of this kind of story taking you on its own journey was like such an interesting one for me, because I mean, I think it's like, you know, students are always asking me like, how do you write from your life, right? And I think that there's some stories, like there's, as I had said, like Last Night is a story out of all of them that is kind of the most in the autofiction vein, and that there are like a true story in there that I had tried to tell in a much more like fiction-y way. And it resisted me always, and it needed almost sort of like an essayistic approach for that story to kind of like crack open. Hill of Hell was the opposite. I had a conversation that maps with a colleague coming back from an event at Bard College, and then we were taking the train together back down to New York, and I had no idea that like on this train, if there wasn't, because the cafe car was closed for whatever reason on this like particular train on this particular route, that like if you were in the know, you could bring like your own alcohol and your own. So like the person who had hosted me like pulled out this kind of like amazing like briefcase that was packed with like sandwiches and 2 bottles of wine, and I was like, and it was like totally copacetic. So we had this like long conversation about just sort of like life and death, and it was really moving, and it really stayed with me. And there was something in there that made me want to try and kind of like represent it in the context of a story. And in my imagination, the entire story was going to be on the train. And I wrote so many really bad versions of that story that takes place entirely on the train. And for whatever reason, like I needed to, what time carried me into, and the break of time carried me into, was really into the realm of fiction. What happens sort of after the train ride is like absolutely outside the scope of my own experiences. And so I think like you were talking about how you think novels are about time, and in some ways I think I mean novels are in a I agree with that. And I think when I think of the structure of anything, for me, it really is a question about time. And it sort of became clear to me at a certain point that this story needed like a capaciousness of time, that it needed to go beyond that train ride. So I think that I mean, I can think of many examples of the stories sort of leading me on their own journeys. And often I would have one idea of like, oh, I'm going to write a story about this. And then the story was like, actually, no, this is just sort of an entryway into like this other thing. And this other thing is what you actually want to be paying attention to. But also I did, at the outset of this collection, want to think intentionally about sort of shape and temporality. I do feel like some of my earlier stories in my previous 2 collections do have a little bit more of a symmetricalness in terms of structure, a little bit more of a neatness, do follow that Freytagian model a little bit more. And I really wanted to break from that. I did want to write stories that in some ways were a little bit like blunter, a little bit more sharp-shouldered, a little bit more like asymmetrical, a little bit messier in that way. So there was I don't like, I think like when I begin working on something, it's coming from such an intuitive place. I'm not starting a story necessarily with that kind of like aesthetic agenda in mind, but it was just like rumbling in like the deeper drawers of the consciousness, like this awareness of wanting to make a different kind of shape in the short form. So I'm glad that you
definitely.
like felt that.
I totally sensed it. Yeah, I mean, each of the stories is so different in terms of the way that just the story is being told, like the way the time works, the way where it goes plot wise, like, and there are like all these like very different looking animals on this same ship. I'm going to use yet another metaphor, and then I'll throw another one out there. Do you know what tangrams are?
Yeah.
I kept thinking each story was like its own like little tangram, where like it had these like sharp edges, and then it made a shape. And I know that tangrams are supposed to look like something like a cat or a dog, except like your stories like don't look like anything except this kind of like abstract thing from a distance. And yet when you like read them, like obviously you enter into this very real life, and so I kept getting that sense. And I was also thinking, I haven't read that book, Meander, Spiral, Explode by Jane Allison. Have you read that book?
I have, yeah.
Okay, because I kept thinking like of the way that, again, what I read about the book is all the different ways that she's looking at different types of structures. And I was just curious if you had, it's not really a question, but I just didn't know if you had anything to say about, I was curious if you had read that book.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to, I think structure, because it's like so I almost feel like structure is an umbrella term for all of like these like different like time and what I mean, and perspective, and it's like all interconnected. And I think I have read that book and often teach from it. And I think Jane Allison does an amazing job of sort of not assuming the Freytagian shape as a kind of convention that we need to like keep working within, unless we, I mean, I know like there are many stories that I love, and I've written many stories that do follow that shape. But just to say, hey, like there's this whole other world of sort of structural possibility out there. And and I think she does a really beautiful job of sort of tracing what some of those.
I have to read it.
I
keep meaning to.
Structures.
Actually, actually, Alex, who's hope still listening, is the one who who I think had recommended that book to me, so I have to check it out. And then I think we just have a few minutes, but and it's maybe a bigger question then. But I forget which review I was reading, and they were talking about how your work kind of gets characterized as like, often the same kinds of words, like uncanny, unreal, magical, and obviously those elements are there. But the more I sort of thought about it, the more I was reading the book, and I was like, actually, it does feel like, in many ways, a kind of upside down version of the world that we're living in. And there's magic, and there's this sort of warpedness that comes into it. But like in many cases, it's not really like so far from possibility. Like that like that second wife job, or that crying job. Like, I don't know. I'm not convinced that that's not like possible.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, those jobs are like out there, and it's just that it's like just a little sort of magnification, to intensify the sense of reality. And I think to me, like the uncanny, I actually taught last fall a class on like haunted fictions, and we read Freud's The Uncanny. And Freud is like annoying in a lot of ways, because it's like all roads lead back to the same place. But in The Uncanny, I mean, The Uncanny is like such a fascinating sort of essay and look at like what makes Freud's understanding of what makes something uncanny. And I always remember, I'm going to get the wordings slightly a little bit wrong, but this idea of like part of the uncanny are things sort of appearing. There's Oscar.
Speaking of uncanny.
Oscar had to make himself known at the end. But this idea of like there's some sort of disruption to reality or time. They having a package being delivered or something, or there's a squirrel. But there's some sort of disruption to our reality or destabilization. And what it makes possible is that it like uncovers something that was intended to remain hidden. And I thought, I was like, oh, wow. I mean, that's like such a beautiful articulation. I mean, I think in some ways of maybe like the enterprise of fiction more like holistically, but I mean, I think that was something that I was really thinking about, particularly at that stage. Like, I mean, the collection book was done you know, but earlier last year when I was still sort of editing, and I was thinking about that sort of, yeah, more Freudian idea of the uncanny, and feeling that deep resonance with it. I think that's sort of like you know, in some stories there is like something that's more overtly uncanny, like there is an actual ghost, or there is an actual sort of haunted dimension. But I think that the kind of maybe the uniting uncanniness is that sense of there is something that appears in this world that was designed to remain invisible, but nevertheless has become visible, and it causes like kind of disruption.
Absolutely. And that absolutely goes throughout. I think in every story there's some element of that. You know, I think of the marzipan lamb and the you know, and I mean all these various elements that have that like real not real kind of situation. So Jane, I know we're
wonderful.
we're wrapping up.
Sadly, we need to wrap up, but I'll let you know, Laura, 2 people who are watching said that their dogs were barking back at your dog.
Oh yeah, I know, he's so loud, and now he's standing next to me, just like so sweet and quiet. But yeah.
Well, I'm glad he joined us. It was lovely. So it's been fascinating and fantastic listening to you guys talk, and I think just hearing about this kind of craft stuff. And can you say one more time the name of that book about structure, just so everyone gets it?
Yeah, it's Spiral, Meander, Explode. Is that right, Chris?
Meander, Spiral, Explode.
Meander, okay, yeah.
By Jane Allison.
Last, no matter what.
Right. Yeah, Explode is last for sure.
So, yes, so that sounds fantastic. So now we want to tell people where to get your books. So you can get Chris Castellani's books. He suggests for autograph copies, check out East End Books in Provincetown, and I'm sure you can order those online. And if you want to snag a signed copy of Laura's book, check out Oblong Books in New York. And if neither of those work out for you, you can always check out the Mighty Blaze store on bookshop.org. And bookshop.org is awesome. They support all small bookstores. So hope you will check out their books, please. You will not be disappointed. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you for having us. Congratulations again, Laura, on this wonderful book.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, huge congrats. All right, thanks to you both. So long, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.